A couple of weeks ago, Blizzard gave the community an opportunity to vote on which of the War Within dungeons are our favorite. And supposedly, the voting is now closed. And in this video, I want to talk about what the dungeon pool is going to start to look like. At least we can assume what it might look like. And talk about why this can be a good or bad thing. So let's dive into it. So WoWhead just posted this article not too long ago, a couple of hours. I'm going to leave it down in the description below. So if you want to look this up for yourself and look at the details, you can. But basically, what it's doing is it's breaking down the NA versus the EU vote. So Blizzard decided to split it up between NA and EU, even though I don't think this really matters because ultimately it's going to come down to which of the four is the most popular, because they're probably not ever going to have a different season pool for each of the different regions. But it's kind of interesting to see which players prefer which. NA prefers some dungeons over EU voters and vice versa. So if you aren't aware of this, this came out a couple of weeks ago, 10 days ago actually. And this is the EU, this is the NA vote. There's also an EU vote as well, which had almost 17,000 voters, where NA had 15,000, which are quite low numbers, surprisingly. I wonder if Blizzard could ever add something in-game where players vote, even though I'm sure maybe not every player cares, especially some of the more casual players, but for someone like myself who is heavily involved in Mythic Plus, I definitely wanted to vote, and I definitely wanted to let my opinion be known. As you can see here, it's no secret, I voted for Floodgate. Floodgate is easily my favorite dungeon out of the entire pool up to this point so far. I like the flexible routing. I think the boss design is extremely good. And yeah, I just overall think it's a very challenging key. I know that's obviously not the same, and we're going to get into that here in a second. So coming back to the WoWhead article, it looks like the top four dungeons, and this is going to be presented in order based off of total votes. And oddly enough, it's also in the same order as EU votes, despite maybe NA preferring something like Dawnbreaker versus EU preferring something like Floodgate. So the top dungeon that we voted for was Ara'Kara. And I'll be honest, I have mixed feelings about this dungeon. While it was extremely easy and fairly lenient in Season 1, the problem that I had with the dungeon was the ridiculous amount of casters present throughout the entire instance from start to finish, and the kind of overlapping nature of these casts with other mechanics, or just all of the casts happening at the same time. It had a very similar feeling to early Rookery during PTR testing and beta testing, where there was an overwhelming amount of casters. You felt like you needed a ton of kicks all the time. We saw Prot Paladin and Aug-Evoker extremely strong in meta classes. Back in Season 1, they were able to lock down most of these casters. So if you were playing with a FODM group or the meta group or composition, you had an easier time in this dungeon than other groups, like myself, who played Brewmaster and didn't happen to play an Aug-Evoker. So this dungeon coming back is kind of... I don't know if it's because people thought it was really easy or if people liked the loot pool, but I think overall this is a dungeon that might need a slight rework. I think Blizzard's design philosophy coming into Season 2 feels a lot better. There aren't as many casters. There's less kick requirements across the board. Now, of course, there's some polls that have a handful of kicks. We can still see this in like the Rookery. There's certain polls in Darkflame Cleft that require like a fair bit of kicks. But for the most part, a lot of these dungeons feel a little bit more tame. Ara'Kara did not, and I hope that they rework or do something with how mobs are CC'd and interacted with from the player's kit, because if you're getting web bolted over and over and over again, you're not going to have a great time in here if you're someone who likes to push content, not necessarily just farm it. Now, on the other hand, what I like about this dungeon is it has access to Ara'Kara's Sack Brood. This was a trinket that was extremely highly valued by most players throughout the entire season, and it's nice for Mythic Plus players specifically to be able to go into dungeons and get loot that they need without having to feel like they need to raid. And I think Sackbrood offers it's a great trinket alternative to something that we might see in a raid. So overall, it looks like it's significantly further ahead. It has almost 2,000 more votes across both regions than the second place dungeon. So Ara'Kara is coming back, and I don't know why, because even like the last boss in Pugs, man, that boss was miserable. In pre-made groups, it was okay, but I do not want to face off against Keek at all. So then the next three dungeons all seem to be a fairly close, like they're all fairly close. They're not a tie, of course, but they're all within like 100 points of each other, which is kind of cool. So we have Operation Floodgate. Now this is a dungeon that I really like. I like it for a lot of reasons though. I think boss design in a dungeon is really important. I think you should enjoy your time, despite bosses might be like, even though some bosses might be difficult, I think there's an enjoyable aspect to boss encounters. And when you're in these fights, they should feel like mini raid fights. And I think Big Mama, the Demolition Duo, Swamp Face, and Giesel Gigasap all feel very different. But there's enough things in the fight to, watch out for, to be scared for, to optimize around. And I think this makes for a compelling dungeon. You can pull a little bit more conservatively, pulling 5-6 mobs at a time. But we're also seeing some groups pull 20 mobs, 10 to 20 mobs. And these size pulls feel really good. And while you're pulling this big, it's not necessarily that you have to. You can go fast and it does speed up the run. And obviously in the highest end of play, you need to pull big. But not only can you pull big, but then it's not like taxing in terms of, okay, now we have 4 kicks we have to watch out for, or 8 kicks we have to look out for. We're going to do this 8 target pull or 10 target pull, and there's 1 caster. And so you have good bosses, large pulls, low kick requirements, and generally like lower group damage, so there is still a little bit of triage that comes out. I just think it's a really good dungeon, and that's why I voted for it. In the NA region, where I am located, it was the 4th highest vote compared to EU, where it was obviously the 2nd, which puts it in 2nd, which is actually crazy that so many more people in EU voted for it that it actually carried it from 4th to 2nd in the overall vote. 3rd, we have Priory of the Sacred Flame. Now, this came in 3rd for both EU and NA. This was a dungeon that I feel like it must be mostly DPS who voted for this, because I think as a tanker, as a healer, this is a more or less infuriating dungeon to me. I'm surprised people voted for this over things like Cinder Brew or Dark Flame. I thought those 2 dungeons feel like I thought they'd have a little bit more general popularity, mostly because Dark Flame Cleft has some fairly good items, from healer trinkets to decently statted items, from like cloaks to necks to rings, that if loot was really involved, I would imagine that Dark Flame would actually take priority over Priory, but clearly not. But people like this dungeon, which surprises me, because I think any dungeon that has a overwhelming amount of sharpshooter mobs, very annoying. If you're not like a DK or a DH who has the ability to move and dictate where mobs are spawning frequently, it's a frustrating dungeon to run as a tank. I think the bleeds in here, I actually was having this conversation with my healer the other day. Bleeds should get reworked. Like bleeds in general. I think bleeds, this might be a hot take, but let me know what you think. And this is a small tangent. I feel like all bleed effects, you can't dispel them, but I think if they made all bleed effects a type of grievous effect, and what I mean by that is if you get healed to full, it removes the bleed. What I like about this concept is that it's thematic to bleeds or to wounds, and it gives the healer or your group, whether it's your tank or the player getting affected by the bleed, an option to remove the dot without feeling like playing dwarf is the only counterplay. Playing in a world where you get hit by an ability, it applies a bleed that lasts for 18 seconds in this dungeon, by the way, and the only way you can remove it is by waiting for it to expire. It's obviously extremely frustrating. There's nothing you can do about it. The only counterplay is playing dwarf, or obviously playing with an evoker who can use cauterizing flames. It would be very cool if that player could pop a defensive before it comes out and then use a health pot or some type of healing ability that they have, whether it's like Healing Surge or Vivify or Word of Glory, to remove that bleed because they're healing themselves to full health. I think if Blizzard reworked bleeds, this dungeon would feel a lot better. It's funny because there are grievous wounds in this dungeon. They're applied by the lynxes, but most people don't pull lynxes in a standard route. So if they did that with all bleeds going forward, I'd be very happy. The boss design in here isn't anything too interesting. I guess the build of boss is cool, but a lot of people standardize a route. The second boss can be frustrating with how Castigator Shield works, though we just found out kind of how it works. And then the last boss is just annoying. I don't know. I'm surprised that people voted for this dungeon. I think the only thing that people voted for was the pull size in here and possibly the trinkets. You have Tome of Light Devotion, which is an insane tank trinket, which I'd be actually very happy to see in next season. Yet, I still don't have it in this season. And then you also have the Signet of the Priory. A very powerful 2-minute cooldown trinket that is a good alternative to players who don't raid, who still want powerful items. So overall, I guess like from the loot perspective and a DPS perspective, this is fine, but I'm surprised if any healers or tanks seriously voted for this dungeon. And last but not least, we have Dawnbreaker. Now, this was voted second in NA, but it was voted fourth in EU, bringing down the total votes just below Priory, putting it at just under 5,000, which puts it in fourth. Now, Dawnbreaker, I think it's suffering from the similar thing that Ara'Kara had, where this dungeon was very easy. The timer was more or less lenient than something like Stone Vault or City of Threads was, even though City by the end of the season was extremely lenient in lower keys. Dawnbreaker suffers from the same thing that I think Ara'Kara suffers from, which it has too many casters. But it has fairly open routing, which is always fun. I think it's fun for any tank player or any group to look at a dungeon like this and try to optimize. I had a lot of fun doing this back in Season 1, where it's like, okay, what can we pull? How big can we pull? And in what order do we pull it to optimize our time and our strategy for the composition we have? When you were playing like something like Prop Paladin or even Vengeance Demon Hunter, you might have had an easier time than someone like myself who was playing Brewmaster. Or if you were playing with triple caster versus triple melee, you'd have to do pulls differently. If you were playing with an in-hand shaman and an Aug Evoker versus like a survival hunter and a fury warrior, you had to pull this dungeon differently. And I personally like this dungeon a lot. My problem with it is similar to Ara'Kara, is that there are too many casters. And too many casters, it needs to be reworked. They have to have internal cooldowns. They should be stopped when they're cast should be locked out when they're stunned. I think Blizzard should bring that back. I'm a pretty big advocate of that. I think it goes a lot for coordination, but I also think it works as a good way to back up kicks. If you're in a pug and everyone kicks at the same time, you can throw in a leg sweep, and then you have a little bit of time till they're stunned, they're locked out for a bit. It puts the ability on cooldown. What Blizzard should do, I think, is take a look at Ara'Kara and Dawnbreaker if they're going to play with these 4 dungeons, and they need to do something similar like they did for Rookery and Priory of the Sacred Flame and be like, okay, there's too many priests in this in Priory, so let's replace them with footmen. There's too many Thunderers in the Rookery, so let's replace them with Rook Guards. If Blizzard can do that for these 2 dungeons, I think it would be a very strong dungeon pool. But I think until they do that, I would imagine that Ara'Kara and Dawnbreaker are... I'm not going to like them as much as Floodgate and Sacred Flame, only because there's just not as many casters in these dungeons, ultimately is what it comes down to. What is funny to note, though, is think about dungeon layout when you're looking at this list. Ara'Kara, I mean, fairly linear, but you can go, at the start, you can go left, you can go right, you can go down mid. The way you can pull, the structure pulls can vary from group to group. After first boss, after Avanox falls, you can go left or right. And then similarly, after you kill Anub Zaketz, I think that was his name, maybe, I don't know. The second boss, once you kill him, when you get into that final area going down to Kikatal, you can go center, left, right. You can go like down to the left, pull boss, pull back up. Lots of routing opportunities. Same with Floodgate. You can go right to second boss, right to first boss. You can do a big pull with Lust. You can shroud to a specific point in the dungeon. You can go up after first boss, Big Mama, and you can glide to kind of any point in the dungeon you want to continue pulling trash in any order and any cadence you'd like. Prior to the Sacred Flame, same kind of thing. You're seeing groups pull small at the start. You're seeing them pull big at the start. You're seeing large trash pulls. You're seeing basically a variance on how players are actually pulling these dungeons. And the same thing happens in Dawnbreaker. Once you get through the first boss, you have this like open layout where you get to choose where to go, which I find it very fascinating that players do overall prefer the 4 open-ended dungeons compared to linear routing, linear routing, linear routing, linear routing, RP linear routing. Interesting. It's just interesting to think about, because I feel like whenever I'm someone who makes tank content and tank guides, it seems like I always get the vibe that people prefer the linear dungeons because they're just simple to understand, and as a tank, there's less anxiety there, right? You don't have to worry about count because the count is almost laid out for you. Now, of course, someone like myself, or I guess high-end key pushers, you like the weird strats. You like the weird skips. Those make the dungeon interesting because you get to pull basically the most efficient trash at all times compared to basically what Blizzard wants you to pull. And so despite maybe more or less tank anxiety coming being reduced by these linear dungeons, most people voted for these. Now, of course, you can assume that there's 3 times as many DPS players, if not more, who are voting. And then that's a whole other voting metric that it's like we're talking about that there's only 30,000 votes total, a little more. So it obviously begs into question, like, how many people actually voted, and maybe it's only because the top end people who actually care about keys are voting. But yeah, it's all kind of interesting to think about. So I'd love to hear what you guys think down below in the comments. The last thing I want to mention is season 3 is coming out this summer. Now we can assume it's probably going to be, I don't know, July, I would imagine, given that it just hit April. So we have April, May, June. That makes sense. So we know that the renown track for the raid goes for at least, like, give or take 18 weeks. And we're about 4 weeks in now, 5 weeks in. So we have another, 13. So if you kind of go off that logic, we're probably gonna see this like maybe late July would be my really early guess, though I'm not someone who sits here and theory crafts the exact date of when something is gonna launch. But then what's interesting about this roadmap, and the WoWhead article does point this out, so I'm just kind of reiterating it, is that there is a new dungeon, which means that, probably similar to Floodgate, at least we can assume, we're going to be seeing these 4 dungeons. Then we're going to be seeing a 5th dungeon that's brand new, which I think is going to be phenomenal. If they can cook up anything like they did with Floodgate, I think if they can cook up something similar, it'll be very good. And which would put us, if they are going to bring back like what they have been doing, bring back dungeons in like old dungeons into the new season and just kind of revamp them, we're going to see 3 old revamped dungeons instead of 4 like we might have expected. So new dungeon coming. We can assume, at least it's maybe safe-ish to assume, that it's going to be Ara'Kara, Operation Floodgate, Priory of the Sacred Flame, and Dawnbreaker. But the one thing that I do kind of want to just mention is that they're going to be season rewards refresh. I don't know what this means. I don't know if they've done anything talking about this, but it sounds like they might be doing a slight overhaul on how players are getting rewarded, whether it's for Mythic Plus, whether it's from the Great Vault. I can't imagine they're going to rework rating as much, but season rewards refresh sounds intriguing, and I'd like to know more about this. Anyways, let me know what your guys' thoughts are down below. Sorry for kind of like rambling on, but this is very interesting. I'm also going to link this WoWhead article down there as well in the description, so feel free to check it out if you'd like to. Anyways, I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.